Hello everyone, Mr. Lipchick here, and our topic for today is the federal budget. Federal budget. Just as individuals and organizations create budgets to manage their finances, the federal government must do so also. The fiscal year of the federal budget is from October 1st through September 30th of the following year. The budget is an important instrument of policy, providing funds to programs that are government priorities and reducing spending in less important areas. Work on the budget starts 19 months before it goes into effect, and it is 1,000 pages in length. The executive and legislative branches share responsibility for the preparation of the budget. The executive branch proposes a budget to Congress, which in turn modifies and adjusts it, then sends it back to the President. The Presidential Budget Proposal. The Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 made it the responsibility of the President to propose a budget to Congress. It must be submitted within 15 days of Congress convening each January. Most of the work on the President's budget is done by the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, and the President's Council of Economic Advisors, or CEA. Each federal agency submits a spending plan to the OMB. The OMB director takes the figures to the President with an assessment of the nation's economy. The President, with his or her CEA and Secretary of the Treasury, make key decisions about how the preliminary budget will impact the President's economic goals and policies. And they will discuss federal spending, taxation, and possible cuts to programs. The President sends his or her budget decisions to the federal agencies with guidelines for preparing their final budgets. The agencies work on detailed budget plans and negotiate with the OMB to bring their budgets in line with the President's decisions. In the fall, the OMB submits a complete budget to the President for a final review and approval. The President may order final changes in response to lobbying and political pressure to keep certain programs. The budget is then sent to Congress. While the President's budget is important to the economic health of the nation, it must be kept in mind that 70% of government expenditures are what are called uncontrollables. Uncontrollables are expenses that are required by law or previous budget commitments. Many uncontrollables are entitlements or social benefits that the government is required to provide citizens by law. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution requires that Congress approve all federal spending. Only Congress has the power to raise revenue and approve spending. Congress may revise the President's budget, and this sometimes leads to a conflict over budget priorities. Congress and the President negotiate extensively over the budget. The Congressional Budget Act of 1974 is part of this process. And prior to this act, the House and Senate had separate budget committees. This made the communications and passing of a budget very difficult. But the Congressional Budget Act of 1974 created the House and Senate budget committees and the Congressional Budget Office, or CBO. The Congressional Budget Office performs the same functions as the OMB, except that it serves Congress and not the President. The Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1985, also called the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act, this law was passed in order to force Congress and the President to work together to reduce budget deficits. It required the OMB and CBO to work together and issue a joint report estimating how much the budget would exceed income and how it would cut it to reduce the deficit. The bill was largely ineffective as it did not meet its targeted deficit reductions. The Budgetary Enforcement Act of 1990, or BEA, was then passed. And this law was signed by President George H.W. Bush and divided spending into three areas. 1. Domestic policy. 2. Defense. And 3. International affairs. Spending that exceeds limits placed on any of these areas would come out of the funding for next year's funding in that area. This law was made ineffective by a major economic recession in 1990 to 1991. Steps in the congressional budget process. Congress, the congressional budget-making process, follows three steps. 1. The House and Senate budget committees review the major features of the President's budget proposal. On April 15th, these committees produce a concurrent resolution using the President's proposals as a starting point. This resolution sets forth the total spending and taxation plan for the upcoming fiscal year. 2. Reconciliation takes place between April 15th and June 15th. The House and Senate committees reconcile the spending and taxing plans set out in the resolution with existing programs. Committees put the changes made during this process into a reconciliation bill that the House and Senate must approve. The bill is supposed to be completed by June 30th. The final step of the procedure set forth in the Gramm-Rudman-Hawley Act to be followed. The final step is for the procedures set forth in the Gramm-Rudman-Hawley Act to be followed. The fiscal year begins on October 1st, and on October 15th, the OMB issues a final report and makes any necessary cuts in the budget to fit the deficit reduction targets. Incremental budget making. Incrementalism. This is defined as the total budget changes only a little, an incremental change from one year to the next. Because of this, the best way to forecast next year's budget is to look at this year's budget. And this is true not only of the federal government, but for most governments and organizations. This method assumes that the government will take in the same amount of revenues next year as this year. That concludes our discussion of the federal budget. Thank you for viewing, and I look forward to seeing you in the live lesson. Have a great day.